Privilege for me to be part of today's celebration marking the establishment of the White Family Sesquicentennial Assistant Professorship. This important moment for our academic community both recognizes scholarly excellence and also ensures the resources necessary to sustain that excellence into the future. Establishing an endowed professorship truly is a transformative moment in the life of the university. And I want to thank Mike and Susan for making this possible. Thanks. I'm really delighted today to be able to introduce Jennifer Erickson as the inaugural recipient of the White Family Sesquicentennial Assistant Professorship. Jennifer received her bachelor's degree from St. Olaf College and earned master's and doctoral degrees in government from Cornell University. An expert on issues of international security and global governance, Jennifer began teaching at Boston College in 2010 as an assistant professor of political science and a member of the International Studies faculty. Her studies assess the impact of arms export controls and embargoes, international reputation, states' commitment to international rules, and how their compliance is affected by domestic politics. She's completed work on a book, Dangerous Trade, Arms Exports, Human Rights, and International Reputation, which will be published next spring. Jennifer's teaching includes courses on globalization and national security, the European Union in world affairs, and Introduction to International Studies. Her publications have appeared in the World Politics Review, the European Journal of International Relations, the Journal of Peace Research, and the Causes and Consequences of Nuclear Proliferation. This fall, Jennifer was awarded the Council for European Studies 2014 First Article Prize in the Social Sciences for her 2013 article, Market Imperative Meets Normative Power, Human Rights and European Arms Transfer Policy. Jennifer's research grows out of extensive fieldwork in the United States and Europe. She's also been a research fellow at Dartmouth College's War and Peace Studies program, and she's currently a faculty affiliate at the Institute for Quantitative Social Science at Harvard University. Jennifer possesses a truly impressive ability to combine excellent scholarship and teaching with transformative student mentoring. The integration of these gifts is what we hope for in Boston College faculty. In the midst of the demands of serious scholarship, her availability to her students is remarkable, as is demonstrated, I think, by their presence here today. A recent BC grad and current Truman Scholar, Narantan Luengrath, describes Jennifer as a true scholar teacher and the greatest mentor she's ever had. In Narantan's words, "I would never have won a Truman Scholarship or even been a half-decent BC student without her support and guidance." I think Mike's words about the importance of the mentors he had here at BC show that Jennifer stands in a great tradition in that regard. Jennifer's lecture today is entitled Dangerous Trade, Arms Exports, Human Rights, and the UN Arms Trade Treaty. It's a great pleasure for me to welcome her to the podium now as the inaugural White Family Sesquicentennial Assistant Professor.
Wow. Thank you all for coming. There was never any question in my mind how I should start this speech, but with my most heartfelt thanks to the White family, to Mr. and Mrs. White and the rest of the White family for their extraordinary generosity to Boston College. Their gift of the White Family Sesquicentennial Assistant Professorship is deeply meaningful to me, not only because I have the great fortune of being honored as its first recipient, which is really quite overwhelming for me, but also for what it means for the academic study and teaching of international affairs at Boston College. I am surrounded by numerous talented faculty who set a high bar in scholarship and in the classroom, and students who are genuinely eager to learn more about the world and thoughtful about their place in it. It is these faculty and students, along with the administration, staff, and alumni, that make the BC community so special. The White family's gifts helps continue to grow this tremendous legacy. I am so grateful to them for their generosity and care for Boston College, and I'm so proud to be a part of the BC community. I study the arms trade. It often seems that this answer to the, "Oh, so what do you research?" question at cocktail parties and other gatherings catches people off guard. I imagine they are wondering, and sometimes they actually do ask, whether the seemingly mild-mannered professor has a secret life brokering shady arms deals in Belgian ports on the weekend. I assure you that I have no alternative career in the arms trade, and that my weekends are solidly filled with mundane professorial tasks of grading, course prep, research, and writing. What drew me to the arms trade were both the intellectual puzzles it presented to me as a scholar of international politics and the policy relevance of the topic. I went to graduate school to study international and European security, and around 2005 found myself absorbed by European debates about whether the EU should lift its arms embargo to China, in place in Tiananmen Square in 1989. The economic arguments were clearly in favor of lifting the embargo, but it seemed to go against the EU's self-conception as a leader on human rights. In the end, the embargo has stayed, but not because of any normative arguments, so much as EU decision-making rules that require consensus to lift it, and the broader politics that swirl around both China and the international arms trade that prevent such a consensus from forming. This initial inquiry led first to a seminar paper, which led me to a dissertation topic, and now to a book. But as I dug more deeply into the topic and read about political processes underway at the United Nations to curb illicit and legal small arms proliferation in particular, I was intrigued by the microcosm of international politics the arms trade presented. Great powers faced with conflicting demands on their interests, security interests seeking to use arms to promote close relations with allies but deny sales to potential adversaries, economic interests seeking to support domestic employment, national defense lobbies, and maintain production lines, and normative interests that seek to support values of peace and human rights by denying actors the tools that can aid in repressing populations and engaging in conflict. How do major arms exporting democracies in particular resolve these dilemmas? And what does that tell us about the relationships between power and norms, domestic politics and international politics, and commitment and compliance with rules and agreements in world politics? These are not simply academic questions, but also questions about current policies with the potential to have profound consequences in international politics. Today, small arms are referred to as the real weapons of mass destruction, and together with major conventional arms are responsible for the vast majority of conflict deaths. Experts estimate that armed conflicts since 1989 have directly or indirectly caused at least 250,000 deaths annually. An additional 300,000 non-conflict deaths per year have also been perpetrated with firearms. After conflict, the widespread availability of arms puts pressure on weak governance structures and complicates economic development. Where governance structures are weak, moreover, black markets can flourish. Most weapons circulating on black markets today were once legal sales. Governments can also use arms to commit human rights violations. Amnesty International estimates that 60% of documented human rights violations involve the use of small arms and light weapons. Major conventional weapons may also assist governments in increasing the scale of oppression. The relationships between arms and conflict, human insecurity, and societal instability have spurred an outpouring of national, regional, and international policies since the late 1990s. Yet the fact remains that conventional arms are the legitimate building blocks of armed forces around the world. UN Charter Article 51 establishes states' right to self-defense and is a fundamental principle of national sovereignty, and has been upheld as justification for states to import and export arms as they choose. Conventional arms can signal friendship and effectuate alliances between states. And as we've frequently heard in recent US policy debates about the Syrian conflict, sending arms abroad instead of troops, rightly or wrongly, has often been seen as a less costly form of foreign policy support. As a result, there are fundamental tensions between states' need and right to acquire and export arms, and the potential consequences of doing so in some cases. Ultimately, what I seek to explain in this project is why states, major arms exporting democracies especially, have signed on to initiatives like the UN Arms Trade Treaty that will go into effect next month. The Arms Trade Treaty, or ATT, is the culmination of numerous humanitarian arms control initiatives since the late 1990s. The ATT is the first ever global, legally binding treaty regulating small and major conventional arms transfers. It seeks to limit arms transfers to states engaged in conflict or severe human rights violations. The final ATT passed the UN General Assembly last year by a vote of 154 to 3. The 3 no's were Iran, Syria, and North Korea. Yet the ATT and related regional initiatives go against strong, well-established historical state preferences for non-interference, export promotion, and foreign policy flexibility. Moreover, in general, negotiating treaties is costly, and implementing them can be more so, bringing both expected costs in adjusting national policy and practice and potential unexpected costs connected to legal interpretations, rhetorical entrapment, and charges of hypocrisy. States making collective attempts to limit illicit transfers outside of state control is understandable and not especially puzzling to me. States want to limit black market forces that can undermine their authority and interests. But why would states set aside strong past preferences to agree to international limits on their own foreign policy behavior? I will argue that this commitment by major arms exporting democracies, states that have big material stakes in keeping international regulations at bay, but who also seek to promote their humanitarian values, is an instrumental response to a normative shift in favor of humanitarian arms control in the post-Cold War era. States, I will argue, use commitment to popular initiatives like the ATT to strategically shape their reputations as good international citizens. In short, they are concerned about looking good and saving face. Simply defined, a reputation is a collective judgment of the character of an actor or the esteem in which that actor is held. Studies in anthropology, sociology, and psychology focus on reputation as feedback to an actor from a community about the image its actions and policies project to that community, whether intentional or unintentional. As a result, states, like companies or people, can deliberately seek to shape their public image and the reputation that results from it. In response to their social environment, states may strategically choose policies to build a reputation among other international actors in line with their self-images as responsible or humanitarian international citizens. Moreover, states can care about their reputation not only for the material benefits it can bring, but also, and sometimes primarily, for its social benefits, such as national self-esteem, international standing and legitimacy, or soft power. As I will argue, reputational concerns motivate states to make such window-dressing commitments to conventional arms control initiatives they would rather not have at all. Whether these image concerns will eventually generate a commitment that runs deeper is not something I can answer here. It is a possibility I am both willing and open to considering, but skeptical of coming to pass, at least in the near or medium term. Other explanations for state commitments do not make sense with the evidence at hand. First, these states see these agreements as costly for their material interests with little prospect of material gain. Their concerns about sovereignty, foreign policy flexibility, national security, and economic well-being have not gone away. Indeed, they have been strengthened in some cases by the War on Terror and the Arab Spring, as well as economic downturn and post-financial crisis austerity measures. Second, domestic political pressures in favor of such policies have largely been absent from these cases. With a few exceptions, the public as a whole pays relatively little attention to the arms trade, while defense industries have supported the initiatives only after their governments have signed on. Finally, I find that states exhibit little internalization of these new norms, either before or after their commitment to new initiatives. Moreover, the use of recipient human rights records to assess arms export applications was absent in pre-existing national policies, with the exception of the United States. But the United States was the sole state to oppose the ATT until 2009. In contrast, the reputational argument can account for why states have signed on in the absence of these pressures and fits with how policymakers, NGOs, and defense industry representatives and experts viewed this commitment. To help appreciate what a radical departure the ATT and humanitarian arms control is from the arms trade as usual, let me give you some background. Prior to contemporary arms exports initiatives, the conventional arms trade took the international spotlight on just 3 occasions. On each occasion, attempts to negotiate failed and reinforced a strong norm of non-interference. Global arms transfer controls first came onto the agenda after World War I. The initial attempt, the Saint-Germain Convention for the Control and Trade in Arms and Ammunition, was signed in 1919. It was motivated primarily by the European powers' desire to keep weapons from falling into the problem actors in areas of colonial influence. The convention was meant to entrust the League with the general supervision of trade in arms and ammunition with the countries in which the control of this traffic is necessary in the common interest. However, the United States refused to bind itself because of concerns about effects on its defense industry and interference with its policies in Latin America. It also quite simply objected to giving power to the League of Nations. And without the US, other producing states also declined to participate, fearing that their industries would be disadvantaged by unequal trade restrictions. Other attempts in the 1920s and 1930s also failed, with major power sovereignty concerns getting in the way. Thus, although the interwar years left a lasting legacy of governments agreeing to give themselves licensing authority over arms exported from within their own borders, international controls were elusive. It was not until the 1970s that arms export regulations returned to the global agenda, this time thanks to US public outcry in the wake of weariness over involvement in Vietnam. Between 1977 and 1978, the conventional arms transfer talks initiated by President Carter were intended to negotiate global restraints, but they ended up being bilateral talks only with the Soviet Union. European producer states declined to participate, not wanting to commit to trade limitations unless they were clear that the superpowers would do so themselves. The talks themselves collapsed due to disagreements both within the Carter administration and between the US and Soviet Union over limits to critical regions. Not surprisingly, politics once again got in the way of arms trade cooperation. The third and final failed attempt to create multilateral arms export regulations came with the end of the Cold War, which was accompanied by a rush of optimism for conventional arms control and international cooperation more generally. In 1991 and 1992, the permanent 5 members of the UN Security Council gathered to create restraints on arms sales to the Middle East. But discussions revealed fundamental differences over the purpose and scope of the agreement. The formal collapse of the talks came when China boycotted in response to US and French arms sales to Taiwan in September 1992. Even a group as small as the P5 was unable to reach an agreement. And as defense companies struggled to remain afloat among shrinking defense budgets in the post-Cold War era, the prospects of multilateral control seemed to fade as export promotion took on new urgency. Unlike contemporary efforts, therefore, these failed predecessor initiatives did not seek regulations based on humanitarian principles, nor were affected states among their champions. Rather, they set out to limit arms transfers to specified unstable regions in line with major powers' geopolitical and industrial interests. Time and again, states' material concerns for sovereignty, national security, and economic well-being won out over cooperative restraint with little contest. Nevertheless, by the late 1990s, conventional arms transfers had re-emerged as a matter of state responsibility to deny transfers to human rights violators in conflict zones. In 1998, the EU agreed to its politically binding Code of Conduct on Arms Exports, and in 1999, the US Congress passed legislation requiring the President to start work on an international arms sales Code of Conduct. And although the 2001 UN Program of Action was a politically binding national-level measure to curb illicit small arms sales, it galvanized states to extend binding regulations to legal transfers as well. The move to begin a formal process to create a global, legally binding arms trade treaty came in 2006, in the wake of the failure of the UN Small Arms Conference earlier that year to transfer that politically binding program of action into a legally binding document to regulate legal small arms transfers. The effort could have ended there, could have been done with it. But by this point, there was widespread support for creating a broader treaty, which had only been blocked by the United States, using the consensus rules of the conference to prevent action. Organizers instead put the ATT initiative to public vote in the UN General Assembly, which passed with 153 votes. Only the United States voted no. Since then, the United States has reversed its formal opposition to the ATT, and the ATT has been negotiated, and it will go into effect later this year. The ATT completes what diplomats in previous eras were unable to do. They established legally binding global humanitarian standards to regulate the international arms trade in both small and major conventional arms. But how did this come about? 3 events in particular are responsible for creating this dramatic normative shift in international expectations for conventional arms control policy. First, the 1991 Gulf War. The Gulf War put many coalition soldiers face to face with weapons sold to Iraq by their own governments during the 1980s, and revealed states' poor control over their arms trade, as well as the destabilizing consequences of exporting arms to a volatile authoritarian regime. This blowback experience and the public outcry that followed in some major suppliers was a cautionary tale for future arms exports and the potential domestic costs of irresponsible arms exports coming to public light. Second, civil and ethnic conflict following the Cold War, especially high-profile conflicts in Africa and the former Yugoslavia, highlighted problems associated with small arms proliferation and the need for multilateral export controls to prevent arms buildup in conflict zones in unstable regions. These conflicts and the peacekeeping and reconstruction efforts to follow pushed small arms to the forefront of the international agenda. Research reports from NGOs and academics spread, pointing not only to small arms' contribution to exacerbating conflict and insecurity, but also to their role in undermining development, human rights, and governance. In addition, states adversely affected by small arms proliferation began to push the issue in international organizations, prompting a string of research missions, reports, recommendations, and guidelines in the early to mid-1990s. By 1997, the initial decision was made to convene an international conference on small arms trafficking. Once ignored, small arms were poised to become the focal point of the international arms control agenda. Third, and finally, the true tipping point for changing the conversation about conventional arms control came with the Ottawa Treaty in 1997. The 1997 Ottawa Treaty to ban anti-personnel landmines passed with widespread success in 1997. And although a ban on anti-personnel landmines is not wrapped up in the same kind of political complexity as controlling broad categories of conventional weapons, its momentum helped galvanize more comprehensive conventional arms control efforts, including the ATT process. The shift in normative expectations about conventional arms control policy was clear. What was less clear to me, and highly important given arguments in international relations literature about why states commit to international treaties, was whether this normative shift was evident in states' arms export practice, that is, in their decisions to approve or deny sales. If states have long been attentive to human rights records in making arms export decisions, perhaps the ATT and its predecessors are merely reflections of what states are already doing, making commitment quite cheap and in line with pre-existing domestic values. On the other hand, if state practice comes to reflect concerns for recipient human rights after new initiatives are adopted, this would suggest some kind of growing norm internalization. As I set out to collect code and analyze the data for this component of the project, I was reassured that either outcome would be interesting and tell me something substantive about both the conduct of the international arms trade and explanations for states' commitment to multilateral humanitarian arms export standards. Of course, in one of the many twists of doing research that we all experience, I found neither of these expected outcomes. Regression analyses on the small arms and major conventional arms export practices of 22 top supplier states from 1981 to 2010 most often showed indifference to recipients' poor human rights records, and sometimes found that recipients with poor human rights received on average more arms than the best human rights performers. I have run the data with European arms exporters only, with democratic arms exporters only, with supporters of the ATT only, and the results are largely the same. Countries with bad human rights consistently receive more major conventional weapons transfers from ATT supporters than countries with the best human rights records. While the very worst human rights performers produce no significant results after the 1980s. In the case of small arms, supplier states seem either to reward or simply ignore recipients' poor human rights. Thus, rather than practice preceding or even following policy, these results show a clear disconnect between arms export policy and practice. States, in fact, are not simply using the Arms Trade Treaty and other initiatives to codify existing practice or to reflect their normative commitments, nor do we see evidence of norm internalization over time. Global policy discussions, rules, and norms are not reflected in how states decide to conduct their arms trade in practice. Thus, while new policies represent a significant shift in international politics, that shift is incomplete. This is not necessarily surprising, as anyone who studies international politics will tell you. Norm internalization can take decades and is never guaranteed. Even so, this policy practice gap provides initial evidence against material or normative explanations for states' multilateral commitments and begs for explanations in which policy and practice need not come hand in hand. Why bother with humanitarian arms export controls at all? To dig deeper, I examined 5 case studies of top small and major conventional arms exporting democracies: Belgium, France, Germany, the UK, and the US. I interviewed government officials, defense industry representatives, NGO advocates, and experts in each of the countries to understand the motives behind states' commitment to the initiatives they once rejected entirely. For the most part, these states have gone ahead with new national and multilateral trade regulations in spite of the wishes of defense producers and in the absence, in most cases, of any concerted public pressure. Rather than such domestic motivations, major exporters have strategically chosen to support new arms export controls out of concern for their international reputations, that is, their desire to be seen by other states as good international citizens. As norms surrounding small and major conventional arms evolved over the course of the 1990s to encompass human rights and human security, so too have the expectations by which states make arms trade policy. In this case, reputation serves as a social incentive with consequences for states' legitimacy, esteem, and standing in the international community. For those states whose identities are strongly tied to their cooperative membership in international institutions, support for responsible arms transfer policies stems in large part from a perceived need to maintain or even better their reputations. The analysis therefore focuses on states' perceived concern for reputation rather than their actual reputation as perceived by other international actors. So how do we observe reputation in action? I never asked questions directing participants to discuss reputation. Indeed, this explanation came out of the interviews I was doing. First, many interview participants directly connect their policy commitment to their image promotion abroad. They said so directly. Second, participants reveal an acute awareness of the stringency of their policies and how they stack up in relation to the policies of their peers, making comparisons about whose are the best and the most responsible. Finally, ministries of foreign affairs typically spearhead state policies, not economics ministries. This, some participants contend, turns the focus away from states' economic interests to their international reputations. There are two sets of reputational pressures became big for major arms exporters. First, after the Ottawa Landmine Treaty, governments, quote, didn't want to be seen as being on the wrong side of history with new humanitarian arms control initiatives. They believed that support for responsible arms transfer control policies like the landmine ban would be good for their international profile. Ottawa altered how states define appropriate arms control behavior, as well as what social gains they thought they could get from their own support. One NGO representative, for example, observed that humanitarian arms control has become fashionable. He stated, "The landmine ban established this high moral ground. It looks pretty bad if you don't support it. This has led to the habit of thinking you can look morally good by supporting weapons-related initiatives." As small arms garnered international attention following the Landmine Treaty, policy support became, according to one German official, really a beauty contest among diplomats who don't want to be looked at uneasily by their peers. Opposition also meant being seen as being in bed with the US, whose own reputation had suffered because of its opposition. States saw the potential for reputational damage if they opposed new policies, but also for a certain kudos that comes with being seen at the forefront of these issues, if they were to come out in support of them. Support for the UN Program of Action, the ATT, and related policies could, quote, give an image that they are doing something and taking some responsibility for the moral concerns of the impact of the arms trade on the developing world. Thus, it is almost, quote, according to one government official, almost unthinkable that states would say this is a bad thing. Second, the United Kingdom's early embrace of humanitarian arms export policies shifted the standard of good policy among major democratic exporters more broadly, providing a reference by which they can compare their policies and assess whether they measure up. British support and leadership on both the 1998 EU Code of Conduct and the ATT stemmed from the British arms to Iraq scandal in the early 1990s, which prompted the Labour Party to put forth a platform promoting ethical foreign policy and arms transfers to win office in 1997. Early support and leadership from a once resistant major exporter made the UK a critical state in triggering the reputational beauty contest among democratic exporters. In doing so, the Labour government sought to use its responsible policies to signal the UK's new image to constituents at home and to peers abroad, cementing good international citizenship as the foundation of its foreign policy. Leadership on transfer controls, it believed, would, quote, look pretty good if it could pull it off. Interviewees also suggest that joining the ranks of ATT leadership in 2004 was a strategic move on the part of then Foreign Secretary Jack Straw to recapture the UK's popular ethical foreign policy image in the wake of the unpopular Iraq War, and show that it could be, quote, a force for good in the world seen again. This early norm adoption and leadership by the UK directly influenced the support of other European exporters in particular. Respondents noted that their support was driven in part by the fear that they would look bad if Britain and others supported, but their country did not. For example, German officials believed that once the UK had announced its support, Germany couldn't not do it without risking the appearance of being irresponsible and uncooperative. Germany would not want to be the one left behind. Similarly, observers argue that Belgian support of multilateral arms standards stems largely from the government, quote, looking over its shoulder at others, and supported new initiatives mainly because of British leadership in the policy standards set by the UK. France, too, once a staunch opponent of legally binding multilateral export controls, announced its backing of the ATT in 2005 on the heels of British support. Since 2001, the French government has identified 2 tracks in the UN and wants to be a part of the good group, which includes the EU small arms leaders like the UK and the Netherlands. Moreover, these moves to keep up with policy expectations have been accompanied by a growing recognition of one government official called the PR element of small arms policy. Support for the ATT and related initiatives has broadly been seen as a way states can enhance their image in foreign policy and international affairs. One French official noted, for example, the role of image is an important consideration in French foreign policy and has carried over into its policies on multilateral export controls. In general, supportive states suggested that they expected their support to bring them the kind of kudos that came to states for supporting the Landmine Treaty. Often, however, this public support has been accompanied with private skepticism about the merits and feasibility of multilateral responsible arms transfer criteria. Many did not anticipate the ATT initiative to pass through and formalize so quickly at the United Nations when they initially offered their support. German officials have worried that the multilateral principles were neither practical nor efficient. French officials expressed concern for sovereignty and security implications of shared standards and were unsure of the value of UN processes. Indeed, France has sympathized with past US opposition, suggesting that it might also prefer a narrower regional measure were it not for its concerns about its reputation in the EU and UN. This distinction between public support and private skepticism lends further support to the argument that reputational concerns can be an important policy motivation. At the same time, officials were very eager to point out the restrictiveness of their own national arms export policies, especially in comparison to international requirements and the policies of other states. Across the board, they expressed a keen awareness of their standing on this issue among other states and how their policies stacked up in comparison. German officials and export reports typically laud the restrictiveness of German policy and compared Germany's efforts in the EU to those of the UK and Netherlands, noting that it is one of the most active states on small arms at the UN. French officials, too, take pride in what they see as the restrictive and responsible nature of French policies. Stated one, quote, "The French image is perhaps not that positive outside, but if you see the work of each person in the process, then it is difficult to see how you could do it better." Like France, Belgium takes pride in its progressive laws, which it describes as the best in class and quite ethical compared to other states. Thus, states seek to measure up and sometimes even surpass the standard setters, hoping to maintain or improve their reputations in line with their self-image as responsible powers in world politics. Finally, in all of the cases, respondents often thought that government's strong support would have been less certain had the ministries of foreign affairs or heads of state concerned about international image not been the key agencies deciding ATT policy. Ministries of foreign affairs, and in France also the office of the president, tend to take note of public diplomacy initiatives and think more about a country's image abroad. Other agencies, like economic ministries, are more supportive of arms export promotion and defense industry interests, leaving them more inclined to think about the material costs of ATT support rather than the social benefits of it. In some ways, the United States is a different story. It was the sole opposing state in ATT votes until late 2009, when it reversed its position to vote in favor of the treaty, which it signed last year. For many, the U.S.'s strident opposition during much of the 2000s was puzzling. U.S. arms export policies are actually considered among the best in the world. New global standards would not likely require substantive changes to U.S. policies. Sensitive issues like civilian possession and transfers to non-state actors were explicitly kept off the table to keep the U.S. at the table. During the Cold War and after, the U.S. had even led initiatives to globalize its best practices and establish shared transfer controls. Although many suggest that its opposition was a response to NRA pressure, I would instead argue that not only was its opposition to multilateralism in this time period much broader than the ATT, but also that the U.S. derailing of multilateral arms export initiatives has strong historical precedent long before the NRA ever got interested. U.S. superpower status and a general view of itself as less dependent on international institutions to define its foreign policy can free it from some of the international reputational concerns that other states had. Even so, this can entail costs in international politics. Studies report that U.S. reputation had suffered as a result of its unilateralist actions and apparent disregard for international norms and rules during the 2000s. In response, the early efforts of the Obama administration were meant to demonstrate its multilateral credentials. Its public ATT support, whatever its private reservations, is a product of its reputation-building efforts to signal a renewed multilateral tone of U.S. foreign policy for international audiences. While the U.S. Congress is unlikely to ratify the treaty anytime soon, a reality that the Obama administration must certainly have taken into account when signing the treaty, some argue that there is still some possibility for change in arms export behavior, much like the United States has largely come into line with the Landmine Treaty despite not signing it. These findings about the sources of ATT support for major arms exporting democracies in some ways are quite sobering for those who wish for a strong ATT. The gap between arms export policy and practice is persistent and will likely be slow to close. There is no guarantee that states will internalize new norms over time. Where norm adoption is instrumental and strategic, compliance incentive structures may be need to designed to make compliance strategic too. The lack of enforcement authority in the new ATT Secretariat will make this difficult. The task of improving and ensuring compliance will therefore fall to domestic politics, where NGOs have consistently found the public difficult to engage in the complex and often bureaucratic questions of arms export policy. As it is, the incentive structure is simply such that the costs of noncompliance are low. In other ways, however, the results are encouraging for ATT proponents. Major arms exporters from Europe once firmly opposed similar policies on economic grounds. Today, they vocally endorse new standards of export control. The United States was the leading opponent of recent initiatives and is now a treaty signatory. Russia and China have not stepped into its place to derail proceedings, but rather have taken a back seat. Major democratic exporters have started to exhibit some concern about compliance at the margins in some cases. The part of the book I'm not summarizing here today argues that the combination of arms export transparency and an active domestic NGO community in some cases has started to make those governments worry about the outbreak of arms trade scandal and reputational damage in domestic politics if arms deals that are perceived as severely irresponsible come to light. Interviewees in all countries but the United States noted that the one time the public sits up and pays attention to the arms trade is when scandal hits the front page, imposing costs on government legitimacy in the process. Of course, public attention is hard to get and hard to hold once you do have it, so this is not likely to be a practical way to improve compliance more broadly. However, it does suggest that the gap between policy and practice can at times create costs for governments and encourage that gap to be closed in the future. I have watched this treaty come into being as my dissertation and book have come into being. As ATT signatories prepare for implementation starting in December, tough questions about monitoring and enforcement remain. Their answers depend on states' ability to strike a balance between continued notions of sovereignty and security attached to their arms trade and evolving ideas about what it means to be responsible international citizens. In some ways, this is international politics as usual. Nevertheless, the ATT is a policy achievement once thought impossible, suggesting that potential, although certainly not the promise of change in international politics, and the consequences of that change for human rights and human security around the world. Thank you.